Hello everyone, and welcome to a new video. Today I'll be attempting to make an 18th century themed dress based on one worn in the first season of Outlander. I attempted to do this in 4 days using about $40 worth of material from my stash, so it's far from a perfect replica, but I still like the finished piece. This project choice was motivated by the cooler weather, a desire to go through my fabric stash, in order to buy more fabric, of course, and the fact I'm listening to Outlander by Diana Gabaldon through Audible, who have very kindly sponsored today's video. But more on that later. Let's get into the sewing. Or at least the cutting. This dress is actually a bodice and skirt set, and I'll be working on the bodice first. I didn't film the draping process for this, since this pattern is actually an altered version of one I've used for most of my 18th century costumes. I think it started as a Janet Arnold pattern, but has been altered to an unrecognizable state. I used an earlier variant for my purple linen dress featured in this video, then refitted the pattern for a floral dress. For this piece, I moved around the seam placement and made a few mock-ups until I was happy with the shape. The bodice is going to be lined with a linen-like material, which is what I'm cutting out now. I seamed these pieces together with 3/4 inch allowances, then pressed all the seams open. I'm marking lines 1/4 inch away from the seam onto the seam allowance, then stitching across those lines to create boning channels. I repeated this for all the seams and made sure to iron everything thoroughly to get rid of any puckers. Even though this bodice will be worn over heavily boned stays, it still needs boning to keep its shape and help it lay over the stays without wrinkling. This might seem odd by modern standards, but most historical outer garments, no matter how casual, had boning or some sort of stiffening in them, even shirtwaists from the turn of the century. And the reason I'm stitching the channels into the seam allowance is because it's faster than other methods and doesn't require stitching additional layers of ribbon or fabric into the garment, so it keeps it nice and lightweight. The boning I'm using for this project is 1/4 inch wide plastic, and I'll leave a link for it down below. I'm cutting each bone to be 1.5 inches shorter than the appropriate channel. This leaves room for seam allowance. After cutting the lengths, I'm sanding the corners down. Even though it's plastic, it can still be sharp and wear through the fabric over time, which you probably don't want. This also makes the corners less prone to catching on the fabric when you insert the bones into the channel, which is nice. After I've added the boning, I like to sew across the bottom edge of the bodice to prevent them from slipping out. Now I'm sewing up the shoulder seam, and we're getting into the tricky stuff. I'll be sewing the sleeves for this garment in a more historical manner, which involves stitching the cap of the sleeve on top of the lining as opposed to sewing them on with traditional seam allowance. So I'm folding the topmost portion of the lining around the arm side inward and stitching it in place, and that pretty much finishes off the lining. Cutting out the top layer of fabric is a little bit more complicated. I'm fussy cutting the front piece out on the diagonal grain of the plaid, and at first I thought I could cut it as one piece, but it wasn't symmetrical enough. So I decided to have a seam down the center front, and I added seam allowance and chopped off the excess. Then I flipped that piece over so the right sides were facing each other, and arranged the cut piece until its edges blended in perfectly with the rest of the print. I pinned it into position, then cut it out. The goal is to have 2 perfect mirror images of the same piece. Unfortunately, this requires wasting some fabric, but the result is a perfectly matched print. I used chalk to mark the seam allowance onto the pieces. Then I basted the pieces together on that line. Now this isn't the traditional basting, just for the sake of temporarily securing the pieces together. The goal for this is to make sure every single stripe and line and piece of the print matches up perfectly. So I'm making sure every time my needle passes through the fabric, it's passing through the exact same part of the print on both sides. This is tedious, but the end result is worth it, I promise. It means you have perfectly matched prints pretty much every time. That's a lot of P's. Once I was done basting, I added some pins for good measure, then stitched across my line of basting by machine. The basting stitches can be removed, then the seam can be ironed. Isn't that satisfying? It would probably be more satisfying if you'd been here for the 30-minute process instead of seeing that happen in 30 seconds, but hopefully it is still pleasing. Now I'm repeating this process with the side panels. The plaid actually goes vertically on these pieces and doesn't need to line up with the direction of the pattern on the front. But I wanted the print to be perfectly symmetrical on both sides, so I'm cutting the pieces out one at a time and carefully placing them prior to cutting them out. Like with the front piece, after one piece is cut out, I use that as my pattern for the next piece, and I'm arranging it on the fabric until it blends in and all the edges line up perfectly. Now it gets trickier. I wanted the side back and front back panels to match up at the side seam, so I'm folding the seam allowance of the side front piece and the seam allowance of the side back pattern piece inward, because you want the print on the fabric to line up where the pieces are stitched together, not at the edges. The edges don't matter. I move these pieces around until the pattern matched nicely, then I cut the side back panels out one at a time. The last pieces are the back panels, and these are cut diagonally, much like the front panels were, and I used the exact same method. Now the bodice construction begins. I sewed the side back panels to the back panels, and the side front panels to the front panels. Then for the side seams, where the pattern needs to match up, I marked the seam allowance and carefully basted across it. This was sewn by machine as well, and this was the last seam that I stitched. You want the shoulder seam to be left open, since that will be stitched on by hand after sewing on the sleeves. In the meantime, I folded the edges of the bodice inward and stitched them down by hand. I started with the neckline. The edges were turned inward by a ½ inch and hand stitched down with slip stitches to avoid visible top stitching. Then I moved on to the bottom edge. I had to notch this edge around the curves for it to turn inward smoothly. Now the lining can be pinned in so the wrong sides are facing each other. This is a messy looking process, so I did it off camera, but it's simple to do. Just make sure all the seams line up and smooth out the top layer as you pin to avoid rippling or puckering. The edges of the lining will hang over the now finished edges of the top layer of fabric. So I'm clipping the edges of the lining and turning them inward so the raw edges are hidden between the layers of material. I repeated this process for the neckline of the bodice, and once again I'm slip stitching the fabric into position. At this point, the back edges and the back neckline are not stitched together, and the straps of the top layer fabric should still be hanging free from the lining. All of that will be secured after the sleeves are sewn on, which means it is time to cut out the sleeves. This is another pattern that has been through a ½ major alterations, and this time around I altered it so it was a single piece without a seam down the center. Instead, it is shaped over the shoulders and elbow with darts. Much like the bodice pieces, I cut one piece out, then used it as a guide for cutting out the other. And I was actually really careful about the placement of the stripes on these pieces because I wanted the stripes on the sleeves to line up perfectly with the stripes on the bodice while my arms were down when the garment was worn. Then I marked the darts onto the back of the pieces, and a lazy way to mark darts is to actually cut the shape of the darts out of your pattern, then trace around the edges. Now I wanted the fabric to line up where the darts were sewn, so I used the same basting method for all of these. And these were stitched by machine, then ironed flat. The side seam of the sleeves were straight, so I didn't think basting was necessary, but I still wanted the print to line up. So instead of basting, I used lots of pins and made sure each pin went through the same point on both layers of the fabric. Now the sleeves could be sewn onto the bodice, at least partially. The bottom portion was sewn on by hand with a 1/2 inch allowance, using a sloppy rendition of the backstitch. I'm not great at structural hand stitching, but I did my absolute best, which is actually pretty pathetic given the quality of the stitching. After the lower sections are sewn, the bodice needs to be positioned on a dress form, or ideally put on by the final wearer. Then the upper portion of the sleeves is lifted up and pinned over the strap with the lining. This allows you to ease out excess volume and get things to lay nicely in the strange angular arm size which were popular in the 18th century. You can also perfectly fit it over the wearer's shoulder, if you have a helper, that is. I'm doing this on my dress form since it is impossible to do on yourself, but I did try it on multiple times throughout this process to make sure it fits smoothly over my shoulders. Once you're happy with the placement of the sleeve, it can be stitched to the lining, and the strap of the outer fabric can be pinned over the lining to cover all the raw edges. I think this is a really handy method and I want to do it more often, but I like modern sleeve setting too, especially with thicker fabrics like this one. Now I'm turning the lining around the back of the neckline inward and pinning it to the top layer of the fabric. And I did this over my knee so I could imitate the breadth of a shoulder and keep the fabric smooth. And now we can all admire that bruise on my leg that looks like a giant bite wound. I promise it's not. Things just got pretty hot and heavy with the corner of a side table. And now I'm stitching all the edges by hand. I used a running stitch to secure the strap and a slip stitch for securing the lining. Now it's back to work on the sleeves because they aren't done. They need cuffs. The cuffs were cut from the plaid outer fabric, which is from Joann's and part of their Platitudes collection, if I didn't mention that already. Fun fact, one time I used a fabric from this range for a pair of pants that I wore to McCall's headquarters, and one of the people working there recognized the fabric from their swatch wall. The cuffs are also cut from fusible interfacing and a lightweight cotton. The cuffs are shaped with a dart and pleat. I transferred the markings for these onto the lining. Then I ironed the interfacing into the plaid material. I laid the lining on top and pinned the dart. I didn't even think to baste this since I didn't think it was going to line up at all, but it did perfectly, which was a very happy occurrence. I ironed the dart over a tailor's ham to shape the cuff a bit. And then I pleated it and ironed the pleat in place. I should have stitched the pleat down at this point, but I didn't for some reason. Instead, I just pinned it, and then I pinned up the side seam and sewed that with a 1/2 inch allowance. I turned the raw edges of the seam inward and whip stitched them to the lining. The cuffs are quite wide, so the interior is actually somewhat visible when it's worn. Then I turned the bottom edge of the cuffs inward by a 1/4 inch with basting stitches. Then it was turned inward by another 1/4 inch and whip stitched to the lining, creating a very neat and tidy hand-sewn hem. And this is when I chose to sew the pleat down. I used some embroidery floss and running stitches for this, and I only stitched down the deepest portion of the pleat near the center since I didn't want it to look too structured. I also turned the top edge inward by a 1/2 inch and basted it down. Now it is time for trim. I wasn't sure if I'd have enough for the cuffs, so I started with the bodice first. The trim I'm using is a silk blended braid that I bought in the Garment District years ago. Like 5 years ago, maybe? It was one of my first Garment District purchases, and I'm thrilled to get it out of my stash, though I did have to dye it navy to match this fabric. And I may not have set the dye properly, so it slowly stained my fingers blue throughout working on this. It was stitched on by hand to the bottom edge of the bodice and around the neckline, and around the hems of the cuffs. It was pretty much stitched on everywhere. While I'm stitching away, I wanted to go ahead and mention this video's sponsor, because as I said earlier, this video has kindly been sponsored by Audible. Audible is an online audiobook service that has the largest selection of audiobooks available in the world. Every month, members get 1 credit for an audiobook of their choosing, plus 2 credits for Audible Originals, which is content created and available exclusively for Audible members. And you'll get 30% off any additional audiobook purchases, along with the ability to exchange any you're unhappy with. And unlike streaming or rental services, the books are yours to keep, even if you cancel your membership. They have free applications for the most common devices and can be listened to pretty much everywhere. So if you'd like to try it out, then you can get your first audiobook for free and try Audible for 30 days by going to audible.com/Angela Clayton or texting Angela Clayton to 500-500. As I said, I've most recently been listening to Outlander, but that is just one of many audiobooks that I've gone through. I adore them because they keep me mentally stimulated without distracting me visually in the way that a lot of content does. They are the perfect background noise for when I'm sewing or editing, especially editing. I had 16 hours of footage for this video alone, so needless to say, any listening recommendations would be appreciated, and I was really excited when Audible reached out to me. So once again, if you'd like to listen to your first audiobook for free and try it out for 30 days, then you can go to audible.com/Angela Clayton or text Angela Clayton to 500-500. Now let's get back into the sewing. The cuffs were sewn to the sleeves with slip stitches. The back seam for the cuff was originally supposed to line up with the back seam in the sleeve, but they didn't. The sleeves were actually too long, and I had to cut a few inches off the hem, which led to the cuffs not lining up quite like I had expected. But you probably wouldn't have noticed that if I didn't tell you. Then right on top of the join point, I stitched on the last of my braided trim. I seriously used up every single inch of this. It was great. Also, for most of this, I had a water bottle stuck in the sleeve so I wouldn't accidentally sew the sleeve closed. I wish I could say that hasn't happened before, but it has. I did a final fitting of the bodice, then turned the back edges inward by 1.5 inches. I inserted a bone into the fold of the fabric, then stitched a bony channel around it. Usually you sew the channel first, but the bone kept catching on the fabric, so I finally gave up and did it this way instead. Then I marked the eyelet placement. These are spaced 1/2 inch from the center back, 3/4 inch from the top and bottom edges, and 1 inch apart. I used a die to create the holes at these points. Then I whip stitched around the holes using 3 strands of embroidery floss until they were densely covered and durable enough to hold up to the strain of lacing. Though metal was sometimes used to reinforce eyelets, metal eyelets didn't begin to be used on garments until the mid-1800s, and even then they were never used on portions of the garment that were visible, just high-stress garments like corsets. That's why I tend to sew all of my eyelets by hand. And that finishes the bodice off, but we aren't done yet. We need a skirt, otherwise the worn photos would be highly inappropriate for YouTube, and I'd have to shave my legs, neither of which are ideal. The skirt starts off as a rectangle, 3 rectangles to be exact, and these should be several inches longer than the desired length of the longest part of the skirt. I think mine were about 57 inches long, and I'm trimming the fabric to make sure that each rectangle has the same horizontal stripe pattern, so they will all line up across the skirt and at the hem. Once the panels were cut, I pinned them together, and I used a lot of pins. Since this is a straight edge, I didn't think basting was necessary, but I used the method shown on the sleeves earlier, where I go through each stripe with the pins to ensure that everything matches up. It's tedious, but it works, and it's less tedious than basting. I also pinned the fabric with some vertical pins just to prevent it from shifting around. And then I stitched the pieces together with a 1 inch allowance. I'm sewing across the pin since I didn't want to disrupt the pattern, but I'm using an industrial machine, so I'm not worried about a nicked pin or broken needle damaging the mechanics. But I wouldn't recommend this, especially if you have a home sewing machine. It's always the best practice to remove the pins as you sew. I repeated that whole process 2 more times off camera, and now the rectangles can be hemmed. The horizontal lines on this fabric made an even hem super easy. I just turned the bottom edge inward by 1/2 inch, then pulled it upward by 3 inches or so until it aligned with one of the wide black stripes. The hem was stitched by hand with matching thread and tiny slip stitches. Like many casual 18th century skirts, the skirt will close at the sides, and to determine the side points I folded my skirt in half and marked an even distance between the folds. Then I cut 2 16-inch deep slashes. This might seem excessively long for slashes, but a lot will get trimmed off later. The slashes were bound with strips of matching material, and it was sewn on with the right sides facing each other, then turned under, and the raw edges were tucked inward, and it was slip stitched down. Now for pleats. Traditionally, pleats require 3 times their finished width of fabric, so 1-inch pleat would require 3 inches of material to create, but that won't provide enough volume for a historical skirt. So these pleats are 3/4 of an inch wide and 3 inches deep, requiring 3 3/4 inches of fabric for each one. I chose to pleat the skirt with 3/4 inch knife pleats since that looked similar to the skirt I was referencing, but I forgot that pleats look wider when they flare over petticoats, and mine are way too wide to be accurate. So in hindsight, I should have made these 1/2-inch pleats. But it's too late for that now. The process for pleating can be slow, but it's pretty easy. You're just folding the fabric on a line, pulling it until it touches another line, and pinning it down, and repeating that a lot. So after about 1/2 an hour of this, you should have a giant pleated rectangle sewn into a loop with side slashes. Awesome! Actually, it's exactly what we need, but it might look less awesome when you try it on, because 18th century skirts can't be perfect rectangles, or at least they shouldn't be. They have to be shorter at the front and longer at the sides and back to allow for the false rumps and plentiful petticoats. A perfect rectangle will never lead to a level hem over 18th century foundations. But we already hemmed the skirt, which means the length variation is going to come from trimming the top edge. I left a lot of ease for this, and here you can see me pinning and pulling the top edge of the skirt until I was happy with the length of the hem. I marked the waistline on one side with chalk, then removed it from the form. I trimmed a 1/2 inch away from the waist of the skirt, and I trimmed half of it, then used the cut half as a guide for evenly cutting the remaining half. This fabric doesn't iron particularly well, so to keep the pleats intact while I worked on the waistline, I temporarily secured them with basting stitches. This fabric feels like a very soft flannel, so seams iron very well, but it doesn't really hold its shape, which makes it not great for pleating and not the best choice for this dress. I think the original was made using a stiffer, heavier wool suiting, which would have set pleats really well, but it probably also cost a lot more than $4 a yard. The waistband is made from more strips of binding, and I stitched it on by machine with the right sides facing each other. Then I ironed it outward and folded it inward. The raw edges were tucked inward and it was whip stitched into position. Like I said earlier, this piece closes at the sides, so the front and back were finished independently. If you're not sure how this works, I will link to some videos in the description box that show the process of getting into a skirt like this, which might help. And the final step was sewing hooks and bars into the edges of the waistband, which should overlap slightly so there isn't a big gaping hole in the side of the skirt. And then this whole project is complete. On its own, when it isn't compared to far superior costumes, I really like this dress. It's similar to things I've made before, but still different enough that it was fun to work on. But when it's compared to the source of inspiration, it's not great. I think one of the things that makes Outlander costumes so striking is their simplicity. A lot of times the garments are quite plain, but they are fit to perfection and the textiles are full of texture. My fabric is kind of lacking that texture, and though the fit is better than other dresses I've made, it's still not quite perfect. Plus, the front of the bodice should be longer, and the pleats narrower, and if I could look more like Katrina Balfe, that'd be swell. But aside from all of that, it's alright. I do really like the color, and I really enjoyed making this, so that has to count for something. I have 1 or 2 more plans for casual 18th century things, but I'm hoping to move more into court attire in 2019 and finally attempt some sack-back dresses. So if you'd like to see that, then you should subscribe. And if you like this video, then giving it a like and a comment really helps me out. Thank you so much for watching, and I shall talk to all of you very soon.